In the bitter cold of winter, the capital seemed frozen in a deceptive calm. The busy streets, typical of this time of year, were illuminated by the coldly glowing streetlights, but nothing could have predicted the event that would disrupt this tranquility. Justice Thomas Kingsley, a revered figure on the Supreme Court, walked with his wife Elena, his arm around his shoulders, in a calm and assured gait. That evening, he was not only a respected magistrate, but also a man of honor, a person who had fought against systemic injustices all his life. This dinner, organized by the Minister of Justice, was not just a simple high-level meeting. It was recognition of his work, his sacrifices, and his commitment to promoting fairness in a system often seen as biased. But what was supposed to be a moment of celebration and pride would quickly turn into a nightmare, a scene of public humiliation that would change the course of the evening forever. Judge Kingsley, with his imposing stature and natural charisma, wore a sumptuous suit. Each step seemed to weigh on the history of the country, as if its simple movement represented years of struggle and ambition. Elena, with discreet elegance, followed him closely, her face lit up by the admiration she felt for him. They were a power couple, united not only by love, but also by the history they had woven together in the area of social justice. At that moment, nothing suggested the injustice that was about to erupt. As they walked through the upscale neighborhood to their parked car nearby, a patrol car suddenly stopped. The tires screeched on the frozen pavement before two police officers emerged with a sudden approach, as if a serious incident had just occurred. The police officers, Agent Moreau and Agent Dupuis, advanced without any restraint, their faces closed, their looks filled with a certain contempt. "You, sir, show us your papers," ordered Agent Moreau, in a voice devoid of any courtesy. He didn't seem to see beyond his own authority and the rules he believed he had to impose without exception. Judge Kingsley, at first disconcerted, took a deep breath. An unspoken tension hung in the air, a heavy sense of racial prejudice and assumption seeping into the situation. In a measured but firm tone, he replied, "I'm a Supreme Court justice, and I have nothing to prove.
I haven't done anything wrong."
His voice, calm but authoritative, echoed in the frigid air of the street. There was no doubt in his mind as to the reason for this arrest. But the police officers, clearly ill-informed, did not seem to appreciate the dignity of the man they had arrested. "We just ask you to show your papers, sir," Agent Moreau replied with a forced smile. "Don't be offended, it's procedure. We're doing our job." Elena, observing the situation which was rapidly degenerating, tried to take control of the situation, to calm things down.
"Thomas, don't get upset.
"Let's just show them our papers and go to this dinner," she said in a gentle but firm tone, hoping to avoid a confrontation that could go wrong. But the police, fueled by prejudices and their own authority, did not heed the appeals to reason. The tension rose instantly. Agent Dupuis, the youngest and impulsive element of the pair, began to raise his voice. "Did you hear what your wife said? You will obey, or I will take you away," he growled, as if humiliation and intimidation were part of his daily life. Judge Kingsley, cornered by the insistence of the police and the obvious injustice of the situation, let anger slowly build within him. However, he did not lose his calm. He responded with a coldness that left Agent Dupuis speechless. "I have nothing to prove to police officers like you, and I'm not going to allow you to treat me like this."
You can't ask me for my papers just because you see me here, in the street. You know nothing about me.
Officer Dupuis, trapped by the authority and quiet dignity of the judge, attempted to make a sudden gesture, to seize the lawyer to force him to submit to a search or a more intrusive verification. But that's when Elena, panicked but determined, moved forward quickly, placing herself between the police officers and her husband. "Stop immediately. My husband is a Supreme Court judge," she said in a firm, confident voice. At these words, there was a moment of astonishment. The police, now caught in the impasse of their ignorance and arrogance, froze. They looked from the judge to Elena, desperately searching for a way to justify their action. But deep down, they now understood the extent of their mistake. Silence settled for a few seconds, while the witnesses, numerous in the street, began to take out their cell phones. Murmurs circulated, faces turned towards the incident. The palpable discontent turned into immediate support for Judge Kingsley. The chilly evening air seemed to warm with the growing outrage that filled the street. Judge Kingsley, controlling his breathing, looked at the police officers with extreme coldness. In an implacable tone he announced, so that everyone could hear, "I will attack you for abuse of power and racism. What you just did is unacceptable. I will not allow this kind of behavior to be tolerated, especially from those who are supposed to protect and serve." The police, now distraught, began to back away, their arrogance dissipated by the reality of the moment. They realized that they had just made a mistake that would have far greater consequences than they had imagined. The judge turned to Elena, whose eyes shone with a mixture of pride and concern. "We're going home, but this matter isn't over. It's just started," he said resolutely. That evening, far from the limelight and formal discussions, a larger confrontation had begun, a fight for dignity, for justice, and for equality, a fight that Judge Kingsley had no intention of losing. By the next morning, Judge Kingsley's public humiliation had already reached disproportionate proportions. The videos, widely shared on social networks, showed the verbal aggression of the police officers and the judge's incomprehension of their behavior. Comments poured in, hashtags calling for justice and equal rights multiplied. The population's disgust was palpable, but division persisted. Some still defended the attitude of the police, insisting on respect for authority and procedure, arguing that they did not know who they were facing. But this opinion seemed to be becoming increasingly rare. The majority of people, shocked, could not conceive that simple officials of the public force would attack in such a brutal manner a respected man, a judge serving at the Supreme Court, and especially a black man. Political voices were raised to express their support for the judge. The Minister of Justice, in particular, expressed his concern at the seriousness of the situation. In a statement, he said the incident undermined not only the dignity of the judge, but also the integrity of the justice system itself. But it was above all the president's speech that made an impression. With unprecedented firmness, he condemned the attack suffered by Judge Kingsley, emphasizing that judicial institutions must be protected at all costs. The president called on police authorities to put in place measures to eradicate such behavior in their ranks. According to him, it was a question of national dignity, and a strong signal must be sent to the police and the population so that such acts can never happen again. Yet much of the discussion took place in the streets, where marginalized communities saw the incident as further confirmation of the systemic oppression they face on a daily basis. Community leaders spoke out through press conferences, interviews, and demonstrations. Their speeches denounced institutionalized racism in the police, a discrimination which, although still rarely admitted by the authorities, was part of the daily life of racial minorities, particularly in working-class neighborhoods. They called for immediate police reform, greater accountability for state officials, and a fundamental change in the way citizens were treated, regardless of their skin color. For his part, Judge Kingsley appeared unwavering in his determination. The situation was far from easy, but he knew that this incident was bigger than just himself. It was not only his dignity that was at stake, but that of the entire justice system. As a Supreme Court justice, he embodied judicial authority, and this public humiliation was a blow to the very integrity of justice. The affair was not just a simple personal revenge, it was a fight for the honor of an entire system. He had sworn to uphold justice throughout his career, and this case was not going to be the exception. So, in record time, he contacted his colleagues, civil rights lawyers and criminal law experts. The network he had established throughout his career mobilized to file a formal complaint against agents Moreau and Dupuis for abuse of power and racism. Their degrading attitude and their total lack of respect for judicial authority were unacceptable behaviors. Pending the investigation, the two police officers were suspended from duty, which had never been seen in a case of this type. It was a strong signal sent to law enforcement and to society. Impunity would no longer be tolerated. The affair quickly became a media phenomenon. Protests in support of Judge Kingsley took place across the country. Hundreds of people gathered in front of the justice buildings, chanting slogans in favor of equality, dignity, and justice for all. Discussions on television sets, online forums, and public gatherings centered on a single question: why, in modern society, Should a man like Judge Kingsley endure such treatment? The media did not fail to recall the historical past of discrimination against minorities and the slow evolution of mentalities in the face of systemic racism. The investigation by influential prosecutors and civil rights lawyers revealed an even darker reality. Agents Moreau and Dupuis were not isolated cases. Through in-depth investigations, it appeared that several police officers had engaged in similar behavior, using their power abusively, and sometimes in a racist manner. Many victims came forward, anonymous testimonies poured in, and the investigation took on a scale that none of the protagonists had anticipated. This scandal would open Pandora's box. The flaws in police ethics were multiple, and the discovery of a climate of institutionalized racism within certain police services took on proportions well beyond what public opinion imagined. The Kingsley affair would thus mark a turning point in the history of the country's justice, forcing a collective awareness of the way in which the authorities exercise their power and the role that justice should play in defending the fundamental rights of each citizen. After several months of investigation, the police officers were finally judged for their actions. The trial, held in a packed courtroom, attracted national attention. Judge Kingsley, as complainant and victim, had agreed to speak. It was a defining moment, and his speech would mark the history of justice. He stood up, with a calm gesture, and the atmosphere in the room became heavy. His words, full of pain but also dignity, resonated deeply in the minds of all those present, but also in the soul of the entire country. What these men tried to do that night, he began, his voice deep and full of conviction, wasn't just an abuse of power. It was a deliberate attempt to subjugate the rule of law to their own little worldview. A world where the color of my skin makes me invisible, where my qualifications and status don't matter, where my title, the Supreme Court, is ignored, and where I am seen as nothing more than a threat, simply because of color.
Of my skin.
He paused, letting those words sink into the minds of every individual in the room.
This world, ladies and gentlemen, must change.
And this change will not happen only through judicial decisions or legislative reforms. It must be born in the hearts and minds of every citizen. It must be collective. We must ask ourselves at every moment, what world we want to leave to our children. The impact of his words was immediate. He did not only accuse these two police officers, he denounced an entire system which, even if it had evolved on paper, continued to perpetuate injustices deep within its workings. What he expressed went well beyond the personal incident he had experienced. He stood as a defender of a universal principle. Justice must be blind to color, status, or origin. The people, through his gaze, had finally understood the extent of the truth he was bringing to light. This speech was not only that of a man who had been humiliated, but that of a man who, through his courage and calm, restored hope in the possibility of true justice for all. At the end of the trial, the sentence fell heavily. The two police officers were sentenced to permanent dismissal. This decision was not limited to the simple expulsion of the guilty. It marked a turning point in the way authorities would henceforth approach issues of systemic racism and abuse of power. Sustainable reforms were proposed, involving reinforced training on racial discrimination, regular audits on police ethics, and the establishment of more transparent control mechanisms within the police. The police selection and training process is also undergoing reviews to ensure that diversity and impartiality would be taken into account, in order to prevent further abuses in the future. Judge Kingsley had not only regained his dignity, he had, through his speech and his action, opened a breach in a system whose flaws had long remained ignored. What began as an individual confrontation had become a battle for the very soul of justice. The country, shaken by the magnitude of the situation, began to question itself. Discussions about racial inequalities, the need to reform public institutions, and the role of authorities in building a just society took on unprecedented proportions. Citizens, regardless of their background, began to mobilize to demand that policies and practices change. The feeling of unity in the face of injustice grew stronger, and the conviction that the country could reform itself grew stronger every day. The judicial system, for its part, found itself at a turning point. If previous reforms had made it possible to establish a more egalitarian framework on paper, it was now obvious that real changes had to take place in practice. Justice Kingsley reminded everyone that justice was not just a matter of laws and regulations, but of human behavior and values. The way we looked at others, empathy, and the personal integrity of individuals in charge of law enforcement became essential. A country could not claim to be just as long as its institutions fueled internal discrimination. It was now time to work towards truly egalitarian, transparent, and inclusive justice. Elena, always at her husband's side, experienced this victory with deep satisfaction, but also with the acute awareness that this fight would not be the last. She knew that the road would still be strewn with pitfalls, that other injustices would arise, that other prejudices would hide in the shadows, ready to burst into the open. However, she too knew that what they had accomplished together had immense power. Their victory was not just symbolic. She brought change, hope, and courage to those across the country who were fighting against an unjust system and a society that did not see them. Together, they had paved the way for a more just future, a future where human dignity would finally be respected, where every citizen, regardless of color or status, could hope to be treated with the equality and respect they deserve.